When my dad passed away, it was hard enough losing him, but what came after was even worse. My sister Katie and I sat in the lawyer's office for the reading of his will. I thought I knew what to expect. Dad always talked about fairness and splitting things evenly between us. But as the lawyer started reading, things took a turn I never saw coming. Katie got everything. His house, his money, his business. Literally every single thing Dad owned was left to her. And me? Nothing. Not a penny. I sat there in shock, trying to make sense of it. This didn't feel right. Dad would never leave me out like that. I looked over at Katie, and she had this smug grin on her face, like she knew it was coming. That's when it hit me, something was off. This wasn't a mistake. Katie had to have had a hand in this. But how? I wasn't sure yet, but I was going to find out. After the will reading, I couldn't shake the feeling that Katie had somehow manipulated the whole thing. We were never super close, but she'd never seemed this shady before. I started thinking back on the last few months. Dad had been sick for a while, and Katie was the one who spent the most time with him. At first, I was grateful she was helping out since I lived farther away and couldn't be there as much. But now, it felt like she'd used that time to get into his ear and convince him to leave her everything. I decided to confront her. I called Katie and asked if we could meet up to talk about the will. She agreed, but when we met, she played it cool. "It's what Dad wanted," she said, acting like it wasn't a big deal. But I could see through her fake sympathy. She wasn't sorry at all. She knew exactly what she was doing. She even tried to say that Dad probably thought I didn't need the money as much because I had a decent job. That's when I knew I had to dig deeper. Something wasn't adding up. After that uncomfortable meeting with Katie, I couldn't stop thinking about how everything felt wrong. I decided to go through Dad's old papers, hoping to find something that would explain why his will had been changed so drastically. When I looked through his important documents, I found an older version of the will from just a year ago. It left everything equally between Katie and me, just as I had always expected. That's when the alarm bells started ringing even louder. Why would Dad suddenly change the will like that, especially when he always talked about fairness? It didn't make sense. I started to wonder if Katie had somehow forced his hand during those last months when he wasn't as strong or clear-headed. Maybe she had convinced him to rewrite the will in her favor, taking advantage of his illness. The more I thought about it, the angrier I became. I knew I needed to figure out if something shady had gone down, but I didn't know where to start. That's when I decided to talk to Dad's lawyer, the one who had handled the will. If there was any chance Katie had done something behind my back, this was where I'd find out. I made an appointment with Dad's lawyer, Mr. Jenkins, who had been our family's attorney for years. He was a kind, older man, and I trusted him to be honest with me. When I walked into his office, I could tell he was surprised to see me, but he welcomed me in. After some small talk, I got straight to the point. I told him I was confused about the change in Dad's will and asked him if he could explain why everything had gone to Katie. Mr. Jenkins sighed and leaned back in his chair. "Your father's final months were tough," he said. He wasn't as clear-headed as he used to be, but he seemed firm about the changes. "Your sister was with him for most of the meetings." I froze. Katie had been involved in those meetings? She never mentioned that. I asked Mr. Jenkins if he remembered any specific details about why the will was changed. He hesitated before pulling out a file. "I don't know if I should be telling you this, but your father did seem confused at times, especially when Katie was around. There were moments where he didn't even seem to understand what he was signing." My stomach dropped. This was worse than I thought. Had Katie manipulated Dad into changing his will while he was vulnerable? It was starting to look that way. But I needed more proof before confronting her. Something wasn't adding up, and I was determined to get to the bottom of it. After my meeting with Mr. Jenkins, I couldn't shake the feeling that Katie had somehow coerced Dad into changing his will. But suspicions weren't enough. I needed concrete evidence. I decided to dig deeper into what had been going on during Dad's final months. I started by talking to his former caregivers. Most of them remembered Katie being around a lot, more than usual, especially in the weeks leading up to Dad's death. One of the nurses, Maggie, mentioned something that caught my attention. "Your sister was always taking him to appointments by herself," she said. I found it odd, considering he had always relied on both of you for things like that. I pressed for more details. Maggie hesitated, but eventually told me she'd overheard Katie and Dad arguing one day. I don't know what it was about, but your father seemed upset. Katie stormed out of the room, and when she came back, everything was different. He was quieter after that. This was another red flag. Katie was making moves behind my back, and Dad was caught in the middle. I realized I needed to find out more about those appointments Katie had taken Dad to alone. If I could trace those visits, maybe I'd uncover the truth about how she manipulated him. I spent the next few days combing through Dad's old records, trying to piece together a timeline. I looked into his medical visits, his bank statements, anything that could give me a clue. Then I found something strange. Several visits to the lawyer's office, always with Katie, all happening just weeks before the will was changed. It was starting to look like Katie had a plan all along. The more I dug, the clearer it became. But I still needed something solid before I could confront her, something that would prove she had crossed the line. After days of digging, I finally found something that confirmed my worst fears. A copy of the revised will from the law office. I couldn't believe it. Katie had not only been given the majority of Dad's estate, but she had also been named executor, leaving me with nothing. It was like a slap in the face. How could she do this to me? I knew it was time to confront her. No more beating around the bush. No more sitting back and letting her get away with it. I was done being the quiet one who just took what came. It was time for me to fight for what was rightfully mine. I called Katie and told her we needed to meet. She was acting all calm and collected, but I could sense the tension in her voice. She knew something was coming. We met at the cafe where we used to hang out. It was surreal, sitting across from my own sister, knowing what I knew. I wasn't sure how to start, but I had to. I slid the copy of the will across the table, making sure she saw it. "What's this, Katie?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "You want to explain why you're taking everything from me? Why you've decided that you get to control Dad's estate while I get nothing?" Her face went pale. I could tell she wasn't expecting me to have the proof. She tried to play it off, but the look in her eyes told me everything I needed to know. "That's not what you think," she said quickly. "Dad wanted me to handle everything, and you know that. Is that what he wanted?" I shot back. "Or is that what you made him think? You were the one pushing him to make all those decisions. You were the one always in his ear when I wasn't around." Katie's smile faltered for a moment. "You're being dramatic," she said, but it was clear her confidence was starting to slip. I wasn't backing down. "No, Katie, I'm not being dramatic. You took advantage of him, and I'm not going to let you get away with it." She didn't say anything for a moment. Then, in a low voice, she muttered, "You'll regret this." I stood up, determined not to back down. "I don't think I will. You've made your choice, and I'm making mine." I walked out of the cafe, holding my head high. I had confronted her, and there was no turning back. The battle was just beginning, but now, I had the courage to fight for what was mine. After the confrontation with Katie, things got more complicated. I wasn't sure what to do next, but I knew I couldn't just walk away. I wasn't going to let her steal everything my father worked for, no matter how many times she tried to brush it off as her responsibility. I called a lawyer that specialized in family estate issues. After explaining the situation, he agreed to take my case. He was confident that with the evidence I had, especially the copy of the altered will, there was a strong chance we could contest it in court. The first step was filing a petition to dispute the will. This meant gathering everything, every email, every conversation, every time Katie had tried to manipulate me or Dad. It wasn't easy, but I had to do it. I spent hours going through old documents, trying to find anything that would help my case. It was exhausting, but I knew it would be worth it. Katie didn't take this well. As soon as she found out I was challenging the will, she tried to intimidate me. She called me and threatened me, saying things like, "You don't want to go down this road. Trust me, and this is going to cost you more than you can afford." She even tried to turn the rest of the family against me, painting me as the one who was causing trouble. But I wasn't scared. I knew I was doing the right thing, and I had my lawyer on my side. He told me to stay calm and keep my focus. Katie's threats were nothing more than attempts to scare me into backing down, and I wasn't about to let her win. The court date was set, and I had never been more nervous in my life. But I wasn't backing down. I showed up to court prepared to fight for what was mine. I wasn't just fighting for money or property, I was fighting for the respect I deserved as my father's daughter. I was going to make sure Katie's manipulation and greed were exposed for the world to see. The tension in the courtroom was thick as both sides made their case. I could see Katie sitting on the other side, trying to act calm, but I knew she was just as nervous as I was. The lawyers exchanged arguments, and the judge listened carefully to both sides. It was a battle of wills, and I wasn't going to let Katie win without a fight. As the days dragged on, I began to feel the weight of the battle. But I also felt a sense of strength that I hadn't felt before. I was finally standing up for myself, and no matter what the outcome was, I knew I was doing the right thing. After the confrontation with Katie, things got more complicated. I wasn't sure what to do next, but I knew I couldn't just walk away. I wasn't going to let her steal everything my father worked for, no matter how many times she tried to brush it off as her responsibility. I called a lawyer that specialized in family estate issues. After explaining the situation, he agreed to take my case. He was confident that with the evidence I had, especially the copy of the altered will, there was a strong chance we could contest it in court. The first step was filing a petition to dispute the will. This meant gathering everything, every email, every conversation, every time Katie had tried to manipulate me or Dad. It wasn't easy, but I had to do it. I spent hours going through old documents, trying to find anything that would help my case. It was exhausting, but I knew it would be worth it. Katie didn't take this well. As soon as she found out I was challenging the will, she tried to intimidate me. She called me and threatened me, saying things like, "You don't want to go down this road. Trust me, and this is going to cost you more than you can afford." She even tried to turn the rest of the family against me, painting me as the one who was causing trouble. But I wasn't scared. I knew I was doing the right thing, and I had my lawyer on my side. He told me to stay calm and keep my focus. Katie's threats were nothing more than attempts to scare me into backing down, and I wasn't about to let her win. The court date was set, and I had never been more nervous in my life. But I wasn't backing down. I showed up to court prepared to fight for what was mine. I wasn't just fighting for money or property, I was fighting for the respect I deserved as my father's daughter. I was going to make sure Katie's manipulation and greed were exposed for the world to see. The tension in the courtroom was thick as both sides made their case. I could see Katie sitting on the other side, trying to act calm, but I knew she was just as nervous as I was. The lawyers exchanged arguments, and the judge listened carefully to both sides. It was a battle of wills, and I wasn't going to let Katie win without a fight. As the days dragged on, I began to feel the weight of the battle. But I also felt a sense of strength that I hadn't felt before. I was finally standing up for myself, and no matter what the outcome was, I knew I was doing the right thing. After the confrontation with Katie, things got more complicated. I wasn't sure what to do next, but I knew I couldn't just walk away. I wasn't going to let her steal everything my father worked for, no matter how many times she tried to brush it off as her responsibility. I called a lawyer that specialized in family estate issues. After explaining the situation, he agreed to take my case. He was confident that with the evidence I had, especially the copy of the altered will, there was a strong chance we could contest it in court. The first step was filing a petition to dispute the will. This meant gathering everything, every email, every conversation, every time Katie had tried to manipulate me or Dad. It wasn't easy, but I had to do it. I spent hours going through old documents, trying to find anything that would help my case. It was exhausting, but I knew it would be worth it. Katie didn't take this well. As soon as she found out I was challenging the will, she tried to intimidate me. She called me and threatened me, saying things like, "You don't want to go down this road. Trust me, and this is going to cost you more than you can afford." She even tried to turn the rest of the family against me, painting me as the one who was causing trouble. But I wasn't scared. I knew I was doing the right thing, and I had my lawyer on my side. He told me to stay calm and keep my focus. Katie's threats were nothing more than attempts to scare me into backing down, and I wasn't about to let her win. The court date was set, and I had never been more nervous in my life. But I wasn't backing down. I showed up to court prepared to fight for what was mine. I wasn't just fighting for money or property, I was fighting for the respect I deserved as my father's daughter. I was going to make sure Katie's manipulation and greed were exposed for the world to see. The tension in the courtroom was thick as both sides made their case. I could see Katie sitting on the other side, trying to act calm, but I knew she was just as nervous as I was. The lawyers exchanged arguments, and the judge listened carefully to both sides. It was a battle of wills, and I wasn't going to let Katie win without a fight. As the days dragged on, I began to feel the weight of the battle. But I also felt a sense of strength that I hadn't felt before. I was finally standing up for myself, and no matter what the outcome was, I knew I was doing the right thing. The day of the court hearing finally arrived. I was both nervous and determined. I had spent the last few weeks gathering everything I could to make my case, the letter from my father, the conversations with family friends, and the legal documents that Katie had tried to hide. I knew this was the moment that could change everything, and I was ready. Katie, of course, was there too. She had this smug look on her face, like she knew everything was in her favor. She had already hired a lawyer, a slick guy who seemed way too eager to twist the truth. It was clear she thought she had already won. After all, she had the will, right? But I wasn't going down without a fight. When my lawyer called me up to the stand, my heart raced. I took a deep breath and looked directly at Katie as I began speaking. My father never wanted this to happen, I started, my voice steady. He never wanted Katie to have control over everything. I've got proof that he wanted me to have a larger share, and I intend to prove that today. I handed over the letter and all the evidence Mr. Carson had given me. The room was silent as my lawyer read aloud parts of the letter where my father had expressed concerns about Katie's spending habits and decision-making. Katie's face turned pale as the words from my father echoed in the courtroom. I could see the panic starting to spread across her face. She hadn't expected this. She had thought the will was all she needed to win. But now, with my father's written words in front of everyone, the truth was out. Katie's lawyer tried to argue that the letter didn't matter, that it wasn't official, but the judge wasn't buying it. He could see that this letter was a genuine reflection of my father's wishes. The entire courtroom could feel the shift in the atmosphere. I wasn't just fighting for money, I was fighting for what was right. Katie's face twisted with anger, and I could see the wheels turning in her mind. She was trying to figure out a way to salvage her position. But it was too late. The letter had already exposed her for what she was: greedy, manipulative, and untrustworthy. I wasn't sure how this would end, but I knew one thing for sure: the battle wasn't over yet. Katie would fight to the bitter end. But now, I had the truth on my side, and I wasn't about to let her win. The moment she thought she had it all, I had pulled the rug out from under her. And there was no turning back. The courtroom buzzed with tension as the judge took a break to review the documents I had provided. Katie was clearly rattled, though she tried to maintain her composure. She sat there, arms crossed tightly, eyes darting around the room as if searching for a way to get herself out of this mess. She wasn't going to go down quietly, I could tell that much. As soon as the judge called us back to continue, Katie stood up with a new determination in her eyes. She walked confidently to the front, ready to make her final argument. Her lawyer followed her, looking even more confident than before, like he knew something we didn't. Katie cleared her throat and addressed the judge, speaking as if she had nothing to hide. "Your Honor," she began, her voice falsely calm. "While I understand my sister's frustrations, the fact remains that the will was executed legally, and it should be respected. The letter she's presenting is nothing more than hearsay. There's no signature, no official seal, just a piece of paper with words on it." She glanced over at me, a smug grin spreading across her face. My father clearly wanted me to have this inheritance. He trusted me to manage the estate, and I've been nothing but fair in every decision I've made. I couldn't believe the audacity of her words, the nerve she had to stand there and act as though I wasn't the one who'd been wronged. I clenched my fists, but I kept my cool. I wasn't going to let her manipulate the judge or the court any longer. The judge didn't seem convinced, though. He raised an eyebrow and looked directly at Katie. Ms. Simmons, the letter your sister has presented doesn't seem to be a casual family note. It appears to be something much more serious. I'll need to consider this evidence carefully. Katie's lawyer immediately interjected, trying to downplay the letter's significance, but the judge wasn't having it. He was beginning to realize that things weren't as simple as Katie had painted them. And just when I thought it couldn't get any worse, Katie took a step forward. In a last-ditch effort, Katie suddenly turned to me, her face twisting in what could only be described as desperation. "You really want to do this, don't you?" she said loudly, her voice breaking. "You're willing to destroy everything we had as a family, all for money?" She paused, her eyes tearing up as if she was trying to gain sympathy. It was a cheap move, but I could see it was working on some of the people in the courtroom. My heart skipped a beat, but I had to keep my composure. I looked her dead in the eyes and responded firmly, "This isn't about money. This is about what's right. I'm doing this because our father would have wanted it. You know it, and I know it." Katie's smug expression faltered, but she quickly recovered, trying to mask her panic with another round of fake tears. It was clear she was running out of tricks. She knew this could go either way, and she was fighting to the very end. But as I looked at the judge and the witnesses in the courtroom, I felt a sense of calm wash over me. I had done everything I could to prove that what she was doing wasn't just about greed, it was about betrayal. And soon, everyone would see it for what it was. The tension in the courtroom was thick. My heart raced as the judge took a moment to review the documents I had presented. Katie's fake tears were no longer having the effect she hoped for. It seemed like the judge had seen through her act. I knew this was my moment, the turning point I had been waiting for. Katie's lawyer was growing increasingly agitated as the judge quietly went through the evidence. He started muttering under his breath, clearly trying to find a way to counter what I had put forth. But the truth was on my side, and I wasn't about to back down. My hands were sweaty, but I kept my composure. As the judge cleared his throat and prepared to speak, Katie shot me one last venomous look. She was angry, but also worried. She knew the walls were closing in on her. "Miss Simmons," the judge began, his voice firm. "I've had the chance to review both the evidence presented by your sister and the arguments made by your counsel. I have to admit, this situation isn't as clear-cut as you would have liked me to believe." Katie's lawyer quickly stood up, trying to interrupt, but the judge held up a hand. "I'm not finished," he said, his tone sharp. Katie sat back down, her eyes fixed on the judge, knowing that her best shot at winning was quickly slipping away. The judge turned his attention back to me. "Ms. Wilson," he said, "you've presented a valid point regarding your father's wishes, and this letter, while not officially notarized, does indeed carry weight. I cannot ignore it." I felt a wave of relief wash over me. The judge had finally acknowledged the truth. But we weren't done yet. Katie's lawyer tried one last tactic. "Your Honor, we still don't have any concrete proof that this letter is legitimate. It could have been fabricated after the fact. There's no way to verify the authenticity of the signature." I stood up then, feeling empowered. "Your Honor, I understand your concern, but my father's handwriting was always distinct. I've kept many personal letters from him throughout my life, and I'm willing to provide those for comparison if necessary." The courtroom was silent as I spoke. Katie's lawyer hesitated, clearly unsure of how to respond. I could tell that this was the moment that would decide everything. My sister was running out of arguments. The judge leaned back in his chair and tapped his fingers thoughtfully on the desk. "Ms. Wilson, I understand your position. I believe further investigation into the authenticity of the letter is required, but as it stands, I'm inclined to rule in your favor." I felt my pulse quicken. This was happening. Katie's plan to take everything from me was unraveling in real time, and I was finally going to get the justice I deserved. Katie's face turned pale. She stood up abruptly, and for the first time, I saw a crack in her once calm exterior. Her mouth opened and closed as if she didn't know what to say. All her manipulation, all her lies were coming to an end. "I can't believe this is happening," she muttered, not to anyone in particular, but to herself. "You really think you're going to win, don't you?" I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The truth was speaking for itself, and soon, the courtroom would see it too. The battle was far from over, but for the first time, I felt like I had a real chance to win. Katie was losing. And I was finally going to get what was rightfully mine. The courtroom was tense. My heart raced as I waited for the judge to finish his deliberation. Katie, now looking defeated, sat with her arms crossed, trying to hide the anxiety that was written all over her face. I knew this was the moment. After everything I had been through, the betrayal, the lies, the manipulation, I was about to get my chance for justice. The judge cleared his throat, and everyone in the room fell silent. I could feel my palms sweating as the entire room waited for his decision. Katie's lawyer stood, ready to protest anything the judge would say, but there was no stopping what was coming. The judge looked down at the evidence one last time before speaking. After carefully reviewing the documents, testimonies, and considering all factors involved, I am ready to make my decision, he began. Ms. Simmons, your claim to the inheritance is not supported by any clear evidence from the will, and the last-minute actions you took to conceal your intentions have only cast doubt on your credibility. Katie's lawyer shot to his feet. Objection, Your Honor. This is entirely. The judge held up his hand, silencing him. The court has heard enough. I've made my ruling. Katie's lawyer sat back down, grumbling in frustration. My stomach twisted as the words I'd been hoping for finally left the judge's lips. Ms. Wilson, the judge continued, turning to me, the evidence you have presented, including the letters from your father and the witness testimonies, are compelling. Your father's wishes were clear, and while the will was not executed formally, it is clear that he intended for you to receive the inheritance. I couldn't breathe for a second. I had won. I had actually won. Katie's face turned a deep shade of red. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. The courtroom murmured, and I could hear the sound of people shuffling in their seats, trying to process what had just happened. The reality of it was sinking in, and I could feel a sense of relief washing over me. Katie stood up abruptly, her chair screeching against the floor. This isn't over, she spat. You'll regret this. You think you can just take everything away from me? Her outburst made my stomach turn, but I wasn't going to back down. I stood tall, staring her down as she stormed toward the exit. The judge turned to the bailiff. Please escort Ms. Simmons out of the courtroom. We are done here. Katie's lawyer, now visibly defeated, lowered his head and sat back in his chair. I could see the defeat in his eyes. He knew the case was lost, and there was nothing he could do to change it. As the bailiff escorted Katie out of the courtroom, I turned to the judge and thanked him. Thank you for seeing the truth, I said, my voice steady but full of emotion. The judge nodded. Justice is often a difficult path, but you were right to follow it. Congratulations, Ms. Wilson. The weight of everything I'd been through, the years of watching my sister manipulate our family, all came rushing back. But this time, I had won. Katie's plans had crumbled, and I had reclaimed what was rightfully mine. As I walked out of the courtroom, I felt like a huge burden had been lifted from my shoulders. But the battle wasn't over yet. There were still steps to take, legal proceedings to follow, but for the first time, I could breathe. My father's wishes were being honored, and Katie's deception had been exposed for all to see. The fight was over and justice had prevailed. I was finally going to get what I deserved. The days following the court decision were a blur. It felt surreal, like I was living in someone else's story. My mind kept replaying the moment when the judge ruled in my favor, and I couldn't stop the feeling of satisfaction. But with victory came unexpected consequences. Katie had made a scene in the courtroom, but she didn't stop there. She started spreading lies about me to anyone who would listen. She told our relatives that I was greedy, that I manipulated the judge, and that I didn't deserve a cent of the inheritance. Some of our distant relatives were actually buying into her narrative. It was frustrating, to say the least. But I wasn't going to let her poison my victory. I knew the truth, and so did the people who mattered. What Katie didn't realize was that her actions had caught up with her. The lies, the scheming, the underhandedness, people were starting to see through it. The relatives who had initially sided with her began distancing themselves. My mom, who had always been hesitant about the situation, now started apologizing for not being more supportive. She finally realized just how much Katie had manipulated her. It wasn't easy. I still had to deal with the whispers behind my back, the side eyes at family gatherings, and even some awkward run-ins with old friends who were unsure of who to believe. But through it all, I knew I had done the right thing. My father's wishes had been honored, and I was finally going to be able to live without the constant fear of Katie trying to take everything from me. But then something unexpected happened. A few weeks after the court ruling, I received a letter from Katie's lawyer. It was a formal request for an appeal. My stomach dropped as I read the letter. She wasn't done. Katie wasn't giving up just because she'd lost in court. She was going to fight this tooth and nail, and I knew that meant I had to prepare for another round of legal battles. The first victory had been sweet, but it was clear that this war wasn't over. I took a deep breath and made the decision to go forward. I wasn't going to let her bully me into submission. Not now, not ever. This time, I would be ready for anything. The fight for the inheritance had turned into a battle for respect. It wasn't just about money anymore, it was about standing up for what was mine, for what my father had wanted, and for the truth that Katie had tried to bury. As I sat down with my lawyer to discuss the next steps, I knew this was going to be a long road ahead. But I wasn't afraid. I was stronger than ever. And I wasn't about to let my sister destroy everything I had worked for, no matter how hard she tried. This time, I was in control. And there was no turning back. The weeks leading up to the second court battle felt like an eternity. Katie's appeal was filed, and I had no choice but to prepare myself for another round of legal wrangling. My lawyer, Mr. Dawson, kept reassuring me that our case was solid, but I could tell this was going to get messy. Katie wasn't someone who could accept defeat, and she wasn't going to back down easily. In the meantime, Katie started making waves on social media. She posted cryptic messages about how family can be so cruel, and how greedy people would do anything to tear others down. She painted herself as the victim, and to her surprise, some people actually rallied behind her. Friends, old acquaintances, even some distant cousins who had previously stayed out of the drama were now reaching out to her, sympathizing with her struggle. I couldn't understand it. How could people believe her lies when the truth was so clear? But then I realized something. It didn't matter. As long as I knew I was doing the right thing, that's all that mattered. I couldn't waste time on people who were easily manipulated by Katie's act. The day of the appeal hearing finally arrived. I walked into the courthouse with my head held high, ready for whatever came next. Katie was already there, sitting with her lawyer and looking smug. She didn't acknowledge me as I passed her. I didn't expect her to, but part of me wished she would. At least that way, we could have a civil conversation. But I knew deep down that was never going to happen. The hearing itself was more intense than I had anticipated. Katie's lawyer argued that the original ruling had been unfair, claiming that I had tricked the judge into making a biased decision. But my lawyer tore their argument apart, point by point. It was clear that we had all the evidence on our side. At one point, the judge looked over at me and asked if I had anything to add. I stood up, took a deep breath, and said what I had been holding back for months. I didn't steal anything from Katie. I'm not here because I want revenge. I'm here because my father wanted me to have what he left behind. And no one, not even my sister, has the right to take that from me. I've fought for this, and I'm not going to let her destroy my father's memory. Katie glared at me, but I didn't flinch. The judge deliberated for what felt like hours, but when he came back, the decision was clear. The appeal was denied. Katie had lost again. I can't describe the feeling that washed over me in that moment. It wasn't joy, it was relief. I had fought for what was rightfully mine, and I had won. Katie was furious. She stormed out of the courtroom without a word, slamming the door behind her. I didn't chase after her. I didn't need to. The battle was over. But I knew the war wasn't truly finished. Katie was going to find another way to cause trouble, and I had to be ready. Still, for the first time in months, I felt a sense of peace. I had stood my ground, and I had won not just the inheritance, but my own sense of dignity back. The legal fight was over, but the emotional toll it had taken on me was far from gone. It was going to take time to heal from the betrayal, to rebuild the trust one had once had in my own sister. But I knew one thing for sure. I would never let anyone, not even family, take advantage of me again. As I left the courthouse that day, I knew that the hardest part was behind me. And I was ready to move forward with my life, knowing that I had the strength to overcome whatever came my way. Katie might have tried to take everything from me, but in the end, I had taken back control of my life. And that was something no one could ever take away. After everything that happened in court, I thought that the worst was over. I had won the inheritance, I had stood my ground, and I had exposed Katie for the person she truly was. But life doesn't always work like a simple resolution in a courtroom. The emotional aftermath lingered longer than I had expected. Katie didn't speak to me for months after the court ruling. Part of me wondered if she ever would again. She had lost not only the money, but also her family's trust, and that kind of betrayal is hard to come back from. I tried not to care, but deep down, it hurt knowing that someone I had once called my sister could do something like this. Meanwhile, I focused on rebuilding my life. I started investing the inheritance money in ways my father would have been proud of, putting some of it into long-term savings, donating to charities that mattered to me, and even starting a small business. I was determined to make something positive out of all the pain. And over time, the weight of everything that had happened started to feel lighter. I began distancing myself from people who had enabled Katie's behavior. That included some of our extended family members who still supported her despite everything. It was clear to me that if they could so easily turn a blind eye to her actions, then they weren't the kind of people I wanted in my life anyway. My circle became smaller, but stronger. I surrounded myself with people who truly cared about me, people who had been there for me even when things got tough. Then, out of nowhere, Katie reached out. She sent me a long text, apologizing for everything. She admitted she had been selfish and blinded by greed, and that she had hurt not just me, but our entire family. She said she regretted her actions, and that she understood why I fought for the inheritance. It was an apology I didn't expect, and honestly, I wasn't sure how to respond at first. I was still angry. I was still hurt. But as much as I wanted to keep my distance, part of me believed that people could change. Maybe she had learned her lesson. But I wasn't ready to let her back into my life just yet. It wasn't about revenge anymore, it was about protecting my peace. So I wrote back, telling her I appreciated her apology, but that I needed time to heal and figure out what role, if any, she would have in my life moving forward. I made it clear that while forgiveness was possible, it didn't mean things could go back to the way they were. Katie never replied, and we haven't spoken since. And you know what? That's okay.